Zuri sat by the riverbank, dipping her toes into the cool water as she stared at the open sky. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in shades of orange and gold. It was in moments like these that she dreamed of a different life, a life beyond the confines of her small village, where she could chase knowledge instead of chores, where her future was not dictated by age-old traditions. She longed for a world where she was more than just a girl meant for marriage. But dreams, she had learned, did not come true for girls like her. Ever since her mother had passed away, life had taken a cruel turn. Her father, once a loving and kind man, had changed after marrying Mama Binta. The woman had woven herself into their lives like a snake in tall grass, slowly, silently, and dangerously. At first, Zuri had hoped for warmth from her new mother, but all she received was cold indifference. Mama Binta saw her as nothing more than an obstacle, a mouth to feed without any worth. While her own daughters wore fine clothes and laughed freely, Zuri was reduced to rags and silence. Then came the day that shattered Zuri's world entirely. She had just returned from gathering firewood when she overheard hushed voices inside the hut. Peeking through a crack in the door, she saw her father sitting stiffly, his face lined with worry. Across from him sat Mama Binta, her lips curled in a triumphant smirk. And beside her, an old man with greedy eyes and wrinkled skin leaned forward, a sack of coins resting beside him. "This is a good match," Mama Binta said smoothly. "Chief Okon is a wealthy man. He will take care of her." Zuri's breath caught in her throat. Chief Okon. The name sent a chill down her spine. The man was infamous in the village, rich, powerful, and cruel. His wealth came from questionable dealings, and whispers of his wickedness followed him wherever he went. "She is too young," her father protested weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mama Binta scoffed. "She is of age. Do not be a fool. The chief wants a new wife, and he has chosen her." Zuri could no longer stay silent. She burst through the door, her heart hammering in her chest. "Father, please," she cried, falling to her knees before him. "Don't do this to me. I beg you." Her father looked away, shame written all over his face. He had no power, no voice against his wife's decision. Mama Binta simply smiled. "It is done." Zuri's fate was sealed. Zuri stood still as the village women surrounded her, their hands working swiftly, adorning her in a bridal wrapper of red and gold. Their faces were unreadable, their voices hushed as they adjusted her headpiece and applied scented oils to her skin. To them, this was a joyous occasion, a young girl being married into wealth and security. But to Zuri, this was no celebration. Her fingers trembled as they rested on her lap, her heart a storm raging within her chest. Every drumbeat outside felt like a nail sealing her fate. She had seen other girls before her walk this same path, forced into marriage, their spirits dimming like a flame deprived of air. She had promised herself she would be different. She had dreamed of a future where she was more than a wife to a man old enough to be her grandfather. And yet, here she was. Mama Binta stood by the entrance, watching with satisfaction. The woman had ensured Zuri had no choice. The moment the marriage was agreed upon, all doors to escape had been sealed. Now, she was nothing more than a pawn in her stepmother's game of greed. "You should be grateful," Mama Binta said, her voice smooth with false kindness. "Chief Okon will take care of you. You will never know hunger." Zuri swallowed the bile rising in her throat. The ceremony passed in a blur. She barely registered the voices, the chants, the moment Chief Okon placed his withered hand on her head as a sign of claiming her. The only thing she truly felt was fear. Then came the wedding night. The chief's mansion was vast and grand, with high walls and servants who moved like shadows, never meeting her gaze. But despite its size, it felt suffocating. Inside their chamber, Chief Okon sat on a cushioned chair, watching her with cold amusement. His presence alone made Zuri's skin crawl. His eyes, dark and calculating, traveled over her like she was a possession he had just acquired. "You are mine now," he said, his voice deep and final. "Your dreams no longer exist. Zuri clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She did not respond, but inside, something within her hardened. She would never belong to him. No matter what happened, she would never surrender. Days turned into weeks, and Zuri quickly realized that the mansion was nothing more than a prison wrapped in gold. The servants feared Chief Okon more than death itself. They moved silently, avoided eye contact, and never spoke out of turn. The women who had once been forced into his home before her were nothing more than ghosts now, their voices stripped away by years of obedience. Zuri, however, refused to fade into the background. She observed everything, the locked doors, the guards who never smiled, the way people cowered when the chief's temper flared. Every night, as she lay in the cold, empty bed beside a man she despised, she whispered the same vow to herself. I will escape. And when I do, I will make them all regret this. Days blurred into nights, each one heavier than the last. The walls of Chief Okon's mansion felt closer, suffocating, crushing the last remnants of hope inside Zuri. She barely spoke, barely moved, only watching, waiting, calculating. She could not let despair claim her. It was during one of these silent days that she met Nia. Zuri had been sitting in the courtyard, staring blankly at the sky, when a girl, no older than herself, placed a bowl of steaming food beside her. Unlike the other servants who avoided her gaze, this girl dared to meet her eyes. You should eat, Nia murmured, glancing over her shoulder. He watches everything. Zuri hesitated but took a small bite. The warmth of the food did little to chase away the cold inside her, but she forced herself to swallow. Who are you? She whispered. Nia. I was brought here 3 years ago. Her voice was soft, but her eyes held a quiet strength. 3 years. Zuri studied her, noticing the worn look in her eyes, the careful way she moved. She had learned how to survive in this house, but at what cost? Days passed, and Nia continued to appear when no one else was around. She never lingered too long, never spoke too much, but in her presence, Zuri felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, comfort. One night, as the house lay shrouded in silence, Zuri heard a soft knock at her door. She hesitated before opening it to find Nia standing there, a flickering lantern in her hand. You need to know the truth, she whispered. Zuri followed her through the winding halls, her heart hammering. They stopped at a locked storage room, and Nia carefully pulled out a key she had hidden in the folds of her wrapper. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. Zuri stepped inside, and froze. Stacks of documents, gold coins, and weapons were piled high. But what made her stomach turn were the ledgers filled with names. Names of people. Women. Children. My God, Zuri breathed. Chief Okon is not just a corrupt man, Nia whispered. He destroys lives. He steals land, he takes what he wants, and when he is done with people, they disappear. Zuri's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about her anymore. She had to stop him. If we can get this proof to the outside world, Zuri's voice shook with urgency. Nia's eyes darkened. Be careful, Zuri. Chief Okon trusts no one. If he finds out, you know. The warning hung heavy between them. Zuri clenched her fists. Let him watch. Let him suspect. She would not stop. She had just found a reason to fight back. From the outside, Zuri looked like a defeated woman. She walked with her head bowed, spoke only when spoken to, and never questioned Chief Okon's authority. She played the part of an obedient wife, nodding at his words, keeping her eyes lowered when he boasted about his power. She became the woman he wanted her to be, or so he thought. But deep inside, Zuri was burning with rage. She was no slave. She was no possession. And she would make him regret ever thinking otherwise. Her first step was gaining his trust. She stopped resisting when he gave her orders. She smiled at him, just enough to make him believe she had finally accepted her fate. At first, he remained suspicious, watching her like a hawk. But after weeks of her perfect performance, he began to let his guard down. You see, "My dear," he said one evening, his voice smug as he sipped his wine. "A woman's life is simple. She only needs to obey, and she will never know suffering." Zuri smiled, forcing sweetness into her voice. "I understand now, my husband." Chief Okon laughed, pleased with himself, never realizing he was walking straight into her trap. With Chief Okon's attention elsewhere, Zuri began searching for evidence. She spent her days observing, memorizing details: who came to the mansion, who left, and who never returned. She listened when his men whispered in the halls, catching names of places and people involved in his corruption. But the most dangerous part came at night. Nia had told her that Chief Okon's private study held the most incriminating secrets. It was a room no one was allowed to enter except for him and his most trusted men. One night, when the house had fallen into deep silence, Zuri made her move. Dressed in black, she slipped out of bed, her heart thundering in her chest. Every step toward the study felt like stepping closer to the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, and she would be caught. She reached the locked door. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a thin metal pin, one she had secretly taken from Nia while pretending to fix her dress. She had spent days practicing how to pick locks using broken hairpins. Her breath hitched as the lock clicked open. Zuri pushed the door open and stepped inside. The study smelled of old parchment and burning oil from the lanterns. Bookshelves lined the walls, but Zuri knew what she was looking for was not in plain sight. She moved quickly, searching through drawers, cabinets, until she found a hidden compartment beneath the wooden desk. Her fingers fumbled as she opened it. Inside were stacks of documents. She pulled them out, her eyes widening as she scanned through them. Land records stolen from poor villagers. Ledgers of money exchanged for illegal dealings. Names of women and children sold like cattle. Her hands clenched into fists. This was it. This was the proof she needed. She stuffed the documents beneath her wrapper, securing them against her skin. Just as she turned to leave, she heard footsteps approaching the study. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone was coming. Thinking fast, Zuri slipped behind a tall bookshelf just as the door swung open. A man entered. It was Chief Okon. Zuri pressed herself against the wood, barely breathing. If he saw the open drawer, she was dead. Okon walked to his desk and sat down with a heavy sigh. He muttered something about ungrateful fools before pouring himself a drink. Minutes stretched like hours. Sweat trickled down Zuri's back as she waited, praying he wouldn't check the drawer. Finally, Okon stood, stretched, and left the room. The moment he was gone, Zuri slipped out and ran. She didn't stop until she reached Nia's quarters. Nia's eyes widened when she saw the stack of papers. "You did it." Zuri nodded, breathless. "Now, we bring him down." Zuri had heard whispers of a secret group of rebels fighting against corruption in the region, men and women who had lost their families, their homes, and their lives because of people like Chief Okon. With Nia's help, she sent a message through a trusted servant, arranging a secret meeting. That night, beneath the cover of darkness, Zuri and Nia made their way to an abandoned hut at the edge of the village. There, waiting in the shadows, was Kwame, a former village chief's son whose family had been destroyed by Okon's greed. "You have proof?" he asked, his voice laced with quiet anger. Zuri handed him the documents. "Enough to bring him down." Kwame's eyes scanned the papers, his jaw tightening. Then, he looked at Zuri with something close to admiration. "You are braver than most men I know." Zuri's expression was steel. "I want him ruined. I want him to suffer." Kwame nodded. "We will make sure of it." As Zuri and Nia slipped back into the mansion, their hearts pounded with anticipation. The first strike had been made. The first seed of revenge had been planted. But Zuri knew this was only the beginning. Chief Okon was powerful. And he would not fall easily. The war had just begun. Zuri had always known Mama Binta was watching. Her stepmother was no fool, she thrived on control, and Zuri's sudden obedience had made her suspicious. At first, Mama Binta said nothing, only watching with narrowed eyes as Zuri smiled at Chief Okon and followed his commands without resistance. But the older woman had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation, and she could smell deception like a wild beast. Then one night, she followed Zuri. She saw her sneak out of the mansion, slipping past the guards with practiced ease. She saw the careful glances exchanged between Zuri and a lowly servant girl, Mia. Mama Binta's lips curled. By morning, she was standing before Chief Okon, her voice dripping with fake concern. "My husband, I fear your young wife is not as devoted as she seems." Okon looked up from his morning feast, his dark eyes narrowing. "What are you saying, woman?" Mama Binta leaned in, her voice a whisper. "She sneaks out at night. I do not know why, but I have seen it with my own eyes." Okon's jaw tightened. He had suspected something, but he had allowed himself to believe that Zuri had truly surrendered to him. Fury burned in his chest. If she was plotting against him, he would make her regret it. He would make her suffer. That night, Zuri moved carefully through the halls, unaware that Chief Okon was waiting. She slipped past the guards and crept toward the back entrance. Just a little further. "Going somewhere?" The deep voice froze her in place. Her heart pounded as she turned slowly. Chief Okon stood before her, his face twisted with rage. Behind him, Mama Binta smirked, satisfaction glimmering in her eyes. Zuri swallowed hard. She was caught. Okon's eyes darkened. "I trusted you, and this is how you repay me?" "I." Before she could speak, his hand shot out, grabbing her by the wrist. His grip was like iron, unyielding, merciless. "You think you can betray me?" he snarled. "I will show you what happens to women who forget their place." Terror gripped Zuri's heart. She knew what kind of punishment he was thinking of. She knew what he was capable of. Before he could drag her inside, a deafening explosion rocked the air. The ground trembled. Screams erupted. Another explosion, then flames. The sky glowed red as the front gates of the mansion were blown apart. The rebels had arrived. Okon cursed, shoving Zuri aside as he pulled a dagger from his belt. His guards rushed forward, weapons drawn, but chaos had already spread. Zuri's breath came in gasps as she stumbled back. This was her chance. The flames, the screams, the fighting, it was all a gift. Mama Binta shrieked as smoke filled the air, her eyes wild with panic. "Husband! We must run." But Okon's attention was on the battlefield forming before him. His empire was under attack. Zuri didn't wait. She turned and ran. Through the smoke, past the bodies, into the unknown. Freedom was within reach. But she knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Zuri ran until her legs burned, her lungs screaming for air. Behind her, flames devoured Chief Okon's mansion, and the screams of battle rang through the night. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Mia was already waiting for her at the secret meeting place deep in the forest. The rebels had done their part. Now, it was time for Zuri to finish the mission. She unwrapped the stolen documents from her dress, her hands shaking as she handed them over to Kwame, the rebel leader. "This is it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Everything you need to bring him down." Kwame took the papers, his eyes scanning the records, the land theft, the missing people, the proof of Chief Okon's corruption. He let out a slow breath before looking up at Zuri. "You have done something incredible," he said. "But we must move quickly." By sunrise, the village elders were gathered. The council, made up of the oldest and most respected leaders in the region, listened in grim silence as Kwame laid the documents before them. "This," he said, his voice like steel, "is the truth about Chief Okon." Gasps filled the air as the elders examined the evidence. Some whispered in shock. Others clenched their fists in fury. "He stole from the people," one elder said, his face dark with rage. "He sold our children," another spat, disgust thick in his voice. "This man is no chief," an elder woman declared. "He is a monster." Zuri stepped forward. For years, you have allowed him to rule over you with fear, she said. But now you see what he really is. He has no honor, no mercy, and no right to walk free. A heavy silence followed. Then, the eldest of the council members, a man who had once been close to Chief Okon, stood up. His voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of justice. Let the people decide his fate. News spread like wildfire. By midday, the entire village had gathered. Men and women, young and old, poured into the streets, their voices rising in fury. Okon is a thief, someone shouted. He must answer for his crimes, another cried. The mob grew stronger, louder, angrier. They marched toward Chief Okon's mansion, their numbers swelling with every step. Zuri walked among them, her heart beating with purpose. For years, she had suffered under this man's control. For years, others had suffered far worse. But now, the people were no longer afraid. Now, they wanted justice. Inside the burning mansion, Chief Okon knew he was doomed. His guards were either dead, captured, or had fled. His wealth meant nothing now. His power had crumbled. He grabbed a sack of gold and rushed to the back exit, where his hidden horse was waiting. If he could reach the next town, if he could bribe his way out. Crack! The front gates burst open. The roar of the people filled the air. Okon's breath turned to ice. They had come for him. The moment he stepped outside, 100 eyes locked onto him. Silence fell over the crowd. Then, a single voice cut through the air. There he is, Zuri said. The man who destroyed so many lives. The crowd erupted. Shouts of murderer, thief, tyrant filled the air as people surged forward. Okon backed away, trembling. Wait. I can pay you. I can. A rock struck his chest. Then another. He tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Hands grabbed at him, tearing at his robes, dragging him forward. His enemies stood before him, the very people he had oppressed. The village elders stepped forward, their faces grim. You have stolen from your people, one said. You have taken lives, another added. You do not deserve mercy, the eldest declared. The crowd howled in agreement. Okon fell to his knees, pleading, crying, begging. But no one listened. Justice had come. Zuri watched in silence. This was the man who had tried to steal her life. The man who had stolen so many others. And now, he was powerless. A part of her wanted to feel pity, but she couldn't. Not after everything. Nia stood beside her, whispering, "It's over." Zuri closed her eyes, letting the truth settle in her bones. Her nightmare was over. But her story? It was just beginning. The dust had settled. Chief Okon was no more. His once mighty empire lay in ruins, his wealth meaningless, his name cursed by the very people who had once feared him. But Zuri did not celebrate. She stood at the edge of the village, watching the sunrise, feeling the first true breath of freedom she had ever known. She had won. But this victory was not hers alone. She looked around and saw the faces of young girls who had been forced into silence. Women who had endured years of suffering, believing they had no power. But they had power. And now, they knew it. The days that followed were filled with whispers. Zuri's story spread beyond the village, beyond the land. Travelers carried her tale to distant places, and soon, she was no longer just a girl. She was a legend. Did you hear? Some would say. A girl, barely more than a child, stood against a monster and won. Impossible, others would whisper, until they saw the truth in the eyes of those who had been there. Zuri had defied fate. She had been given a life of chains, yet she had chosen freedom. She had been sold like an object, yet she had claimed her own destiny. One evening, as the village gathered around a warm fire, someone asked her, "How did you do it? How did you face such darkness and survive?" Zuri smiled, her eyes full of both pain and pride. They tried to break me, she said softly, her voice carrying through the night. But they only made me stronger. She looked at the young girls in the crowd, their eyes wide with hope. My revenge was not just mine, she continued. It was for every girl who was silenced before me. A hush fell over the crowd. And then, one by one, people nodded. Because they understood. Because they would never forget. Zuri never sought a throne. She never wanted riches. But her name lived on long after she was gone. Because she had changed the world, not with magic, not with weapons, but with something far greater. Courage. And so, whenever a girl stood against injustice, whenever a woman found strength in the face of fear, someone would whisper, "Remember Zuri." Because legends never die. They live on, in those who refuse to be silent.